Going live. Okay, we're
Okay.
live. Take it away, Chair.
Okay, so welcome to the third meeting of the ORTC community group. Next slide. So just to remind everybody, since there's a bunch of new people who have joined the community group of the IPR policies, basically you need to join for us to be able to take your comments and contributions and adopt them into the specification to make sure that there's no IPR issues regarding any submissions. That's the takeaway from this. Next. So for this particular meeting, I want to discuss the status of the ORTC specification as it is now, discuss the progress that we made on the last month's issues. We'd like to discuss some of the use cases that we want to cover for ORTC to make sure that when we have an end result, they can do these use cases. Discuss some of the issues around parameters and capabilities, and discuss what to do there. And finally, what is our ORTC end result? Like, when do we think we're complete, and what is going to be the end game result when we get there? So we'll talk about that later. Next slide. Nothing to say here except you can go to ortc.org to find out more information. It's got the link to the official community group homepage and the link to the slides there. Next page.
There's one thing. This is an edit that's about an hour old, and just recently I added another line here that called out for a scribe for the W3C IRC chat room.
Oh, okay. Did you, is this an older slide? Because if this isn't reflecting reality, we're going to have a little bit of missync in the slide numbers because there was some last minute edits that happened. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. All right, so yes, we do need to subscribe on our IRC channel. Eric, do you want to give the information for the IRC? And if someone can volunteer to be a scribe for this particular meeting to take some notes, that would be fantastic.
Yes, the IRC chat room is irc.w3.org, and the channel is ORTC.
Yeah, everybody should join, I guess, right?
Yeah, anybody that's going to be involved in the call should certainly join that. I've put a link on the homepage of the or on the post for the meeting on the community group site, as well as ortc.org for the IRC chat room. So if you're looking for a link, you can go to the community group homepage, and you'll see it on the post.
So do we have a volunteer before we be the tutorial? It'd be hard for me to do it, otherwise I would volunteer myself, but I don't multitask well.
Yeah, my hands are full.
I can try to do the ARC one.
That would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Emil.
Doesn't have to be perfect. Just capture, people's comments as you go, and don't have to rewrite what's already on the slides, obviously. Okay, so next slide. These are just informational links, and everybody can find the slide and link to them and therefore contribute, find out how to contribute and where to contribute. Don't really want to comment more on that. We've got a lot to go through today. So next. Again, associated sites, it's an easy link, ortc.org, to have pointers to everything. Next slide. So Bernard, do you want to talk about some of the changes since you actually did the physical edits for these things?
Okay, yeah. So a couple of things about the changes. We went through the spec and tried to fix the example code to match up with the API. So hopefully all that is right, and one of those was example 5, but we pretty much edited every other example as well. We added an explanation of how to do ICE restart.
And there was a comment by Justin to say he doesn't feel that the ICE restart problem is fully solved.
Okay.
I don't quite fully understand why, but if you want to mention it, Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is that all the sort of ice freezing stuff that we're talking about, and I'll talk about later, also will have to apply on an ice restart. So it's not okay to just create a new IceTransport and slam it into the sender and receiver, because it won't go through the freeze sort of process when it's actually being pulled up along with the other ones. So basically, I think we're basically we've had a somewhat naive view on how ICE works, and I think what we're probably going to have is this controller object will really drive ICE and then also ICE restarts.
Okay.
I need to come back to this and reopen this issue.
Yeah, so we probably have to reopen it. We probably need a proposal on either how to use it or any API expansions that we need to make it facilitate this capability. So.
Okay. There were a bunch of complaints about the way the errors were handled and events in general, so I've hoped to try to clean up the events. And also there was some missing error callback functions, so hopefully all that is fixed now. Also a bunch of nits about the API. Hopefully those are fixed. Peter had an issue about setting and retrieval of the RTCP SSRC, so hopefully we fixed that. There was a discussion of how to get just audio or just video capabilities, and so we put in something for that. A bunch of things were partially addressed, but there's still more work needed. We made some edits to the GetStats interface. Harold has made a fairly big proposal for improving that, which is still in progress, and we'll take more from that as that continues to evolve. And we added a few little SVC additional knobs and also some more examples related to scalable video coding.
I want to mention regarding the SVC, it hasn't been yet firmly decided that we want these knobs and we need these knobs. Right. So these need to be potentially rolled back as well as discussed on the list to make sure that we're all in agreement exactly what we want based upon the use cases that we decide.
Yeah, I'm expecting that to evolve, certainly. Yeah.
And do you want to add something, Justin?
Just as a matter of how we do stuff going forward, I think that until we have, especially for stuff that is not just a nit, that we need to have consensus joint from the CG before we add it into the spec, because it's hard to keep up with often all the mailing list traffic, and this is something where I think it's getting the stuff right on simulcast and SVC, since it's like a core part of the value prop. We need to make sure that we're all aligned on this before it goes actually into the draft.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, we'll have a discussion on use cases, and hopefully that will all be a little bit more clear.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Next slide. So the question is the community group okay with the direction we're going, aside from the previous mentions of ICE restart and SVC issues? And is there any questions about the specification as is right now? And now's the time to speak up. So it sounds like people are, by lack of saying anything, I presume that people are okay. So, okay, next.
I would just mention, Robin, that those of the people that aren't in the actual Hangout call here that might be in the IRC room or watching the feed, if you want to chime in, the best way to do that is via the IRC chat room. So if you're not in the chat room and you have input, please get in the chat room. It's irc.w3.org, and the channel is ORTC.
Right. And if someone does post something and I just skim by, please interrupt me and let me know, because I'm not always able to keep track of everything. Next slide. So these are things that we know we have to do, and so they're going to be coming attractions regarding the stats, IDP, and the behavior of the RTP listener, and the latching rules have to be defined for the receiver object. Okay? Next. So, issues for today. Review the RTCP non-mux and ice freezing proposal that came from Peter. Want to discuss the additional use cases on top of WebRTC 1.0. Some of the issues that we're having around params versus capabilities. An explanation of what is filter params. A little bit of beat up upon it, but not to meaning anybody needs to actually defend it, but to explain why we might want to treat this as a JSL versus built-in APIs and decide actually what we want to do. That's more why we need to talk about filter params and create params than actually deciding whether these are the way we should do it or not. And then finally, the ORTC endgame of how do we wrap up a whole community group at the end when we're done. Next slide, and I'd like to ask Justin to kind of discuss the ice freezing proposal, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. So one of the things that was sort of pointed out, and we discussed this in the most recent meeting, was that when you're doing ice, the way the checks need to happen is in a certain order. And if you have multiple, as they say in ice, media streams, which kind of correspond to our IceTransports, you need to sort of match up, do the candidate checks between two corresponding pairs of IceTransports, say for the audio transport, before you start doing the checks for the video transport. And the reason for this is twofold. One, it prevents you from having a billion connectivity checks going all off at once. It makes sure that you actually get that both sides are trying to check the same things at the same time, so you actually get something working before any sort of binding pinholes time out. And secondly, once you've actually figured out what works for the first media stream, you can use that intelligence to get the second media stream going faster, because you can try using the things that actually, the same foundations that actually worked in the next media stream. So what this means is that there needs to be a way to have some sense of ordering within like the IceTransports that we have. Currently, if we're doing bundle, this isn't a big issue, but there will at least be some cases where we don't do bundle. And so we need to have a way that the transports are ordered in the checks that they do, and that ordering is matched up with the ordering on the remote side. And the way that this is dealt with in 1.0 in SDP land is that the ordering is dictated by the order of the M sections and thereby the transports in SDP. So one thing we talked about, and go to the next slide. One thing we talked about previously was whether we could do this implicitly. We know all the IceTransports. Why can't we just paste them in certain thing, like what order they're created in? We wait for the first one to be created and then the second one, etc. And one thing that we sort of realized was that, well, you might have two simultaneous sessions to two distinct endpoints, and those sets of ice checks need to proceed in parallel. That if you have two IceTransports for the first session and three IceTransports for the second session, they should each be checking their first respective IceTransports at the same time. And so any notion of implicit progress by virtue of like what order the IceTransports were created doesn't work. So we need to have some sort of way of doing per session grouping, and I think that's better that this be explicit as opposed to somehow implicitly done by the implementation. And the way that I think we're going to manage this is through a new object that Peter and I are proposing, RTC transport controller. Next slide. And so the transport controller basically has, it's a controller for all the transport-related operations. And we establish a sort of grouping for a given session. Each session has a single RTC transport controller, and all the RTP transports associated with that session are then attached to this RTC transport controller. And in addition to the actual freezing and unfreezing stuff that I mentioned before, and the ordering of which lines get checked first, this also allows individual sessions to have their own bandwidth estimation, or bandwidth estimates. And so if you're calling two people at the same time, and somebody is on a fat pipe and somebody's on a narrow pipe, well, those things ought to be treated separately so that the media quality for the first session is you can send the full rate, and then for the second session, what you actually end up seeing is you're going to send at a lower rate to meet the demands of the second session's narrower sort of congestion, basically a narrower bandwidth available to the second session. And so the the transport controller will basically separate the IceTransports into specific sessions. And what this really means then is that the session object that exists in WebRTC 1.0 peer connection, if we decided that we wanted to expose this as like a doohickey or something like that in the future, this would hang off like the peer connection object. So let's go to the next slide and we can get into more details. So here's what the actual method or the actual object is. It's fairly straightforward. There's a way to basically add transports and specify what order they're in, and then you can get the actual ordering of the transports that have been added. And so if you're shipping 1.0 on top, you can basically figure out what is the ordering of the transports that have been added, and figure out how you should set up your M lines, M sections that you're generating, so that you have the same ordering as what the RTC transport controller thinks it has. One important point here is that since the freezing is between sort of different media types or media streams from the ICE perspective, you don't need to add any RTCP transports to the RTC transport controller. You just add the RTP transports, because those are the ones that the freezing ordering has to be figured out for. And I'll talk about next how we deal with RTCP. So if we're going to support non-muxed RTCP, we need to have a way to create an ICE transport for the RTCP and make sure that the transport, when it's created, knows that it should have a different component number than the one for RTP. And this is important because the candidates that it generates will have to indicate that it has component 2, and the priority of any connectivity checks, the priority of any candidates that are generated, need to indicate that they're for RTCP. Similarly, when the freezing stuff happens, we want to make sure that we do the unfreezing on component 0 first, and then we move on to component 1. And so what this sort of calls for is a need to say that for a given RTP ICE transport, we need to say here's an RTCP ICE transport that's really a slave to this RTP ICE transport. Next slide. So the way we do this is by adding a new method to RTC IceTransport to basically say, give me an ICE transport that can be a slave to this master RTP transport. And the slave that we're going to create is, we indicate what component we want by an enum that's really analogous to the ICE component number that's defined in 5245. So in reality, you'll specify this thing called RTCP, and it'll really just be a sort of a shorthand for saying I want component 2, but it'll give you a new transport object that's already set up with the right component number, so it generates the right priority, and it generates the appropriate component number in any candidates that are gathered. And so the way you end up using this is that if you're going to support non-RTCP MUX, you create the RTP transport the normal way. You then create the RTCP transport from the RTP transport, and then in the params, you'll have a value indicating whether you can do RTCP MUX. And if the other side reports back and says, hey, they want to do RTCP MUX, then the sender will be configured to then start exchanging multiplexed RTCP, and you can throw away your RTCP ICE transport. If you decide not to MUX, then the sender will decide to use the associated ICE transport to actually send its RTCP, and from then on out, it acts like any other ICE transport. And that's it.
I just wanted to mention one little addition there. 2 comments. One is that you don't need to use the controller if you don't want to. It's an optional thing. That's why it is a separate interface, as far as I understand it. Correct, Justin?
Yeah, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether we're going to be able to get away with that, I have to say.
Okay.
I'm sure we could probably make it optional, But I think that we would probably be losing. I think we would probably want to discourage that. Just because I think that the same things that I mentioned before. Like if you only had one ICE transport, you wouldn't really need the transport controller, and so I kind of agree that should work. But if you're going to have two ICE transports, you're going to have the same sort of freezing. You won't be able to take advantage of the benefits of the freezing algorithm, and so I think we probably could allow that to work. But I don't think we want to position this as you only need it for backwards compatibility. I think it's like you want to use this if you really want to use this pretty much for anything, because it'll make sure that the right things happen, especially if we have anything else in the future that requires this sort of per session grouping. So I've called it transport controller to be a little bit abstract, so that if we need to add more per session type stuff in the future besides bandwidth estimation and ice freezing, that we could also be taken care of at the same time.
Okay. Thank you. And the other thing I wanted to mention, there was a question regarding the ability to fork these RTP and RTCP transports, because the created an associated transport does create an implicit ICE listener. And after reviewing it, I'm under the firm belief that we don't have to do any special logic here to make sure that forking. We have to do a little bit of special implicit behind the scenes stuff to make sure forking works. So we'll have to describe that in the doc, but it will work. So anybody who has those fears, I believe I can have a private discussion with you and lay them to side as to how that can work. Are you talking, Justin? Because I can't hear you. I think he's talking, but I can't hear him. Is it just me?
No, I can't hear Justin either.
No, he's probably just moving his lips.
I don't think he's lips.
I think he's trying to talk.
Yeah,
Justin, we can't hear you, bud. Justin, we can't hear you.
Oh, wait, it's an Android.
Justin can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Justin.
Something happened to your mic. Yeah. That's unfortunate timing. Okay. I'm going to give him a moment to see if we can get him back in so he can finish off his point.
Yeah, he's likely going to rejoin here in a minute.
Just to get clear, Robin. So
okay, there he is. He's back. It's working. Go ahead.
All right, where did I drop out?
We didn't hear a word you said after I spoke.
Killing effects of Robin. So talking to Peter, I had the impression that I didn't have time to go through and for the slide today, incorporate all the discussion from the list. But I was under the impression from Peter this is mostly considered solved, and I assumed the way that would be solved would be having a way to create an associated ICE, unless it's the same way that you can create an associated ICE transport. Is that what you were thinking, Robin?
No, actually, I'm saying that you don't even need to do that. It can be entirely hidden from the application's developer's point of view, and it'll just work. So we don't need to add anything. It's actually working perfectly as is.
Okay.
Which is great.
Would you mind sort of, just point me to the message or whatever where it's sort of explained. I won't hold up the call here.
Yeah.
I just want to sort of verify that I come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, no, fair enough, and I will, and I haven't really explained myself as to why yet, but I can certainly do that if it's not clear from that conversation. Okay.
What I think ought to happen is that we should make a new proposal, whatever that incorporates that, just to make sure that the right thing ends up going into the spec. So if you can kind of send me what you think should happen, we'll update the design on our side, and then we'll turn that back around.
Okay.
Yeah, in particular, if there's anything that implementers have to do to make that magic happen, that would be great to put in there.
Yeah, we have to make sure when we define the spec, it's enough that implementers can take it and know what to do. So you're absolutely right.
So can you take whoever's taking minutes, make an action for Robin to send me how the ICE listener stuff he thinks ought to work in this case, and an action for myself to basically incorporate that into a new proposal.
Okay. Perfect. So before we continue on to the totally different topic here, I just want to get feedback from the community or silence for that matter. Is there any questions regarding this? Any objections to this? Because I would like to say let's adopt it if everybody's okay.
Yeah, the only questions were about the ICE listener, so if we're good with that.
Which will be a separate proposal anyway, so.
Yeah.
Okay. I take it by silence we have consensus. Good. Happy.
There was an action point about Robin explaining that's in the message, and what was the second action point?
Peter to actually, sorry, Justin to actually review it and then update his proposal accordingly to his interpretation, and make sure it actually makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so changing gears here, now that we've stamped that one for approval by silence, I would like to discuss, well, there was some issue brought up in terms of what are we actually trying to achieve with this ORTC API. It's kind of hard to say what the API needs to do if we don't have input guidance as to actually what it needs to achieve. So I'm sure that everybody at this point, and I'm kind of saying this jokingly, has read the WebRTC 1.0 use case and requirements. And the idea here is that we would like to say that we can do everything that every use case that was proposed in the WebRTC use cases, plus pick 3 really useful cases that we want to make sure work that may or may not work very well in the WebRTC 1.0 proposal. So, and those use cases I'll get to in detail, so I don't want to mention them now. But if you go to the next slide. Without having everybody going off for the next half an hour and reading all those use cases, I think this is particularly for the browser implementers, especially to say, hey, do we agree that we want to support WebRTC 1.0 use cases? Is there anything in there that is a little bit, funky that we shouldn't support? That goes for the rest of the community group as well. And can we agree that we're going to cover those use cases? And if you don't think so, why and what?
Yeah, I don't think the RTC web use cases were really API dependent, so I would think it would apply to everything.
I've got a question regarding the, I hate to bring this up at all, but is there a use case in 1.0 that specifically says we must all agree to the MTI, because I want to avoid the MTI, mandatory to implement codec in ORTC. Like, for me, it's an API and should have nothing to do with that. But is there a use case regarding that?
I think there's a requirement regarding that, but not a use case.
I mean, I don't really see how that. I don't see how it's super relevant. I mean, I think ORTC is going to inherit that one way or another. I don't see how ORTC will be can really have any policy regarding that.
Okay, I would like not to have a policy. That's kind of my point.
Well, I mean, like we can talk about this in the Endgame, but like I don't think we get to make up our own minds on that. Is as someone might say, a decision above our pay grade.
Exactly. Okay, as long as we're in agreement with that, I don't think I have anything else to say on that. Does anybody have any objections to the WebRTC 1.0 use cases? Apologies for not giving people adequate time to really review it. But if you do, I would say propose it to the list. But if anybody knows anything up front, please say so now.
Also, if you have objections to the use cases, bring it to the ITF, which is where they're being worked on. So.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, my general feeling is we should start sort of collecting things that we think we might want to throw off the boat in the future, because something like, say, RTCP MUX. I don't know if we all think that this is something that we should mandate in the future. Right now, it's mandatory to implement, but not mandatory to use. But we have actually been fairly effective in RTC Web in saying, well, you must do these certain things. You must be this tall to ride this ride type stuff. That you have to do DTLS, you have to do ICE, and if there are certain things that we think there's not a need to accommodate, we can try to say, well, those things are no longer permitted. That you have to do, say, just for example, RTCP MUX. and we can try to argue for that in RTC Web so that we don't have to worry about this, perhaps in ORTC or future versions of the API. So that's just an example, but if there's other things where we find ourselves thinking, gee, things would be life would be easier if you didn't have to support like this legacy wart, we should start making a list of that, and we can take that to RTC Web.
That's a fair comment. And I'm not going to ask for consensus and agreement that we must adopt all use cases in this call, because people haven't been given adequate time to do that. I more want to bring it to your attention that our objective goal or stated goal is to try and satisfy all those use cases unless there's a strong reason not to. Okay? So anybody else have any comments? So use case number 1, which is above and beyond WebRTC. And this is to justify some of the technologies that we're incorporating. Alice is sending Bob over a Lossy WAN network on a mobile device. And we believe that justifies SVC, FEC, and RTX. Justin, do you want to comment on that? I think that would be useful.
Okay, so just dialing back to what we sort of articulated as our main value propositions are, the ability to do sort of more complicated fiddling, with things like layer, things like simulcast, things like FEC, the ability to do, not have to have like an SDP, a state machine and SDP signaling. These are the main things, and I think that the use cases should really speak to those, main value propositions of increased control. And in this particular one, it's, well, I want to make sure that I have am set up for good redundancy, and that what I'm going to do is I'm going to use SVC to get good redundancy for my video, and for audio I might turn on Opus FEC as well. And I can, since I have direct access down to this through the encoding parameters, I can kind of turn up or on or off, the actual FEC directly on the RTC RTP sender itself. So that's what I think this one sort of meant to demonstrate is, I'm using, some of these more advanced techniques because I know that I'm going to need that sort of error resiliency in my actual use case.
Yeah, one thing to mention about this is I think there's also maybe an implicit assumption that there might be differential protection of the base layer versus other layers in SVC.
Exactly.
So you might just retransmit the base or just FEC the base. It should be understood that that's typically a multi-stream feature. That is, you need different SSRCs to do that. But
yeah, maybe not between Alice and Bob, but when you're using an SFU
right.
for sure.
An SFU, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of that, let's go to use case number 2. And we've got basically use cases where Alice and friends are using a conferencing service with different bandwidth capabilities, and it might be an SFU with SVC. And another scenario where Alice is sending a thumbnail and a big picture video simultaneously, where she's using spatial simulcast and temporal scalability. And a little bullet point here to really make mention that these are just possible combinations, but the idea here is that you can mix and match simulcast and SVC together to achieve what you want for your conferencing scenarios. Do you want anything, Justin? I think we lost your audio again.
No, I was just kind of reading stuff again. Just in the last bullet point, this could be spatial simulcast, but it could also be spatial scalability. I mean, the only difference in my perspective from simulcast and scalability is that the scalability has inter-layer protection. Yeah. So, the 2 bullet points to me are in many ways like isomorphic. But I think overall there are a few points you've touched on here, just the SVC, simulcast, and temporal scalability, all of which that might be employed in this particular use case.
Yeah. Just one thing to note, though, this use case does not employ quality scalability, just something to keep in mind.
Right. And I think the quality scalability case is one where I've heard various things about its efficacy, and so I do want to be a little bit careful about although we might think quality scalability would be useful in this multi-point conferencing case, say to have a super quality layer if you have the bandwidth. I don't want to overpromise. So it would be useful if anyone has sort of experience from using quality scalability and can speak to exactly where it would be useful. Like, let's make sure we have that experience driving the actual requirements for the use case.
Yeah, it's worthwhile to say that in commercial products, as far as I know, there's only one product I'm aware of that implements quality scalability. A bunch of products only implement spatial simulcast and temporal, so it's also worth saying that temporal scalability is built into VP8, VP9, and HEVC, as well as, of course, H.264 SVC. So you can get a lot of bang for the buck with just spatial simulcast and temporal scaling, no other modes of SVC.
And I would agree with that. And I just want to further mention there's I'm aware of 6 different simulcast modes from my research.
You mean SVC modes?
SVC modes, right? And I'm not sure which ones we do want to support, don't want to support. I think the take home here is we should probably pick what we really think we should achieve for this base API and make sure that if we ever slap an additional one or have use cases in the future for it, it's possible to bolt them in without having to redesign the API, at least hopefully. So it'd be nice to give some thought, but not too much.
Sorry, so what modes are you aware of besides the base, quality, spatial, and temporal modes?
Fidelity, object-based, and different. So there was one called Fidelity. I have no idea what it does. There's one called that are object-based, and there's another one which is color layering.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know who uses these, why, or where they would be applicable. I'm just saying that I'm aware of them.
Yeah, I think the important thing is to realize what's built into what codecs, and I guess the point I was trying to make is the capability to do spatial simulcast and temporal scaling. There are at least 4 codecs that can do the combinations of both of those, right? VP8, VP9, HEVC, and H.264 SVC. So it's one of those things where it's very common among the codecs that are likely to be in browsers. So that's a big win. Whereas once you start adding things like spatial simulcast, most H.264 SVC implementations, for example, do not support it.
And I really think for the conferencing scenario, we can probably get 80 to 90% of what people need without potentially even ever considering those other scalabilities. So yeah, so let's try and concentrate on the heavy hitters at first. Okay, so the next use case are non-call scenarios where you're not really doing two-way stuff, or you may be doing limited two-way stuff. So a good example is a security company who monitors a bunch of one-way cameras which require low frame rate but high quality. And maybe they would have a button where you could push a panic button to do two-way audio on demand. The reason why it's difficult in WebRTC 1.0, or we believe it is because of the nature of negotiation where you have to do a bunch of M-line matching when you're only really doing one way. Makes it really challenging, and perhaps needlessly so. So that's it for that. And so before we go into the next discussion, is everybody in kind of agreement this is what we should shoot for over and above what WebRTC shoot for? Are we missing anything? And is anything in here too erroneous, which we should probably ignore, etc.?
Just one comment on this last use case, Robin. There's also another, I think, much more prevalent use case that applies here, and that would be best described by the Amazon Mayday button.
Right.
One-way video, both bidirectional audio, and some application sharing. So that's I think a much larger use case. Just FYI.
Sure. I mean, I think the key thing here is that it should be a scenario that we think is complicated to do or impossible to do with WebRTC 1. And I'm not sure that application sharing is one of those things where it sort of meets that description.
Yeah, I mean, presumably it is being done with WebRTC 1, so.
Exactly.
Yep. No, I'm just making mention of it.
Okay. So has anybody got any comments on the use cases, and can we agree that this is what we are going to try and achieve? I know they're a little vague, and again, consensus with silence is fine.
Well, I think what we probably need to do is create a little bit of a document that would basically incorporate these things and indicate why it's complicated or impossible with WebRTC 1, and then show how it could be done simply with WebRTC 2. And I think that these don't need to be exhaustive, but I do think that if we agree that the things I mentioned before are the key sort of value things that we're delivering, we should have some use cases that clearly articulate that.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. I don't know.
Just,
sorry, go ahead, Emil.
Yeah, sorry. I think there's one major difference here between WebRTC and ORTC in capabilities, and I'm not sure which use case captures that. And that's basically the possibility to start and stop streams without extra signaling, which can be very useful in a bunch of scenarios. Maybe obviously the conferencing one, maybe the video surveillance one. I'm not sure, but this is one thing that's currently impossible with WebRTC 1.0. I consider that a big problem and a big advantage for ORTC.
Okay. So that might be, which use case do you think that would best sort of roll under that we described, or should it be its own new use case?
I actually think multiple use cases can benefit from that. Obviously, the conferencing one, basically any use case where you have repeated arrivals and departures of sources of media streams. Yeah.
So it sounds like in our document, when we're talking about the conference scenario, we should particularly pay attention to that point and as a clear advantage.
Right. Yeah, I think we need a little more detail on exactly why it's an advantage. But yeah, the conference one seems like the right place to add detail.
Well, there was a lot of detail on that when we had the plan wars in RTC Web. So we can probably reuse some of that. But if we are writing such a document, I volunteer to provide scenarios where this thing is useful.
Okay, so we probably should have an action item where someone is responsible, not necessarily for writing the entire document, but for getting the document started and allowing people to jump in and add their comments and details to it. And unless you want to do that, Justin, I don't mind at least starting the document. I'm almost paranoid that his mic went dead, so I don't know if he has anything to say.
Yeah, it did.
It did. Right to be paranoid.
Yeah.
Well, at least we didn't volunteer him while his mic was dead and he couldn't say no.
Would you like to take on that task, Justin? I'm giving you the opportunity. So.
Sorry, I had my audio bug revisit itself. What was I just signing up for?
I didn't volunteer. I was just saying, unless you want to do that yourself, which I'm perfectly happy to let you do, I'm willing to at least start the document to the point where people can come and jump in and add their 2 cents to that.
Sounds great.
Okay, so action items for me to start the document, then other people can jump in, like you, Emil, and Justin, and Bernard, and whoever else wants to join. More the merrier, or sometimes it is. Okay, so otherwise, does anybody have anything to say regarding these use cases? Because we've got a lot to discuss.
Yeah, we're coming up on 11 o'clock, and we're barely halfway through the deck. So, heads up.
Okay. Then let's continue on, saying that we agree that these use cases are the framework to create a document with. All right. So we're going to jump between, I think, 3 different people throughout this little part here. But just to reiterate, the take-home here is not to get everybody firmly understanding what everything does, the detail, but just some of the issues that we're running into as editors and trying to define all of this to have the later discussion of doing JSL versus built-in. So trying to get you up to speed into some of the problems here. So one important fundamental concept here is params versus capabilities. Capabilities defines what RTP and codec features the browser engine is capable of doing, and parameters defines the exact usage configuration what you want to use for RTP and the codec features. Just as a general overview. Do you want to talk about the next slide, or do you want me to regarding the filter param big picture, Justin?
Why don't you go ahead, Robin?
Okay. Oh, great. Filter params. Again, the capabilities tell the browser, tells JavaScript what it can do. Parameters tells the browser what it's going to do. And we have 2 methods, both of which are optional right now. You don't need to use them as an ORTC application developer. And they're called create parameters and filter parameters. And the idea here is that by using create parameters and filter parameters, you can easily set up, without a lot of heavy lifting, all the parameters you need to do simple use cases, as well as do some simple negotiation scenarios with that. That's kind of the big picture scenario of what you can do. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the big difference between create parameters and filter parameters is that create parameters, based upon a capabilities set, will create you a default configuration. That's what create parameters is all about. Whereas filter parameters is more about taking an existing set of parameters and manipulating them based upon a set of capabilities so that you only have enabled what you have capacity to do. So if someone, remote party said, give me a whole bunch of different things, but you're not actually capable of doing it, you want to filter out the stuff that you don't want, as well as can't do. So the 3 big points here is that filter parameters works upon existing parameters, whereas create parameters creates you new stuff. Filter parameters actually implicitly filters local capabilities, but can work against remote capabilities. And filter parameters works on both receiver and sender capabilities, which you have to remember are not necessarily uniform, meaning that your sender capabilities and your receiver capabilities are not always the same. Okay? Next slide, which I'm dreading. I don't really want to walk you through these examples. I think the concept here is more important to understand.
But I think it is worthwhile to say this is just a summary of examples 7 and 8, what they're trying to do. And what examples 7 and 8 do is that they essentially filter sender parameters through receiver capabilities.
Right. So the idea here is that, sorry, Bernard, if you want to explain it, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically what happens is Alice goes ahead and creates, you could call it an offer of sorts, sends its receiver capabilities along with its sender audio parameters, which it got from sender.create params, right? So it sends that to the other side, and then it gets the equivalent stuff in an answer from Bob, and then it creates its audio send parameters, filtering sender.filter parameters, filtering the sending parameters that it created through the capabilities of the receiver, Bob. And then it creates its receiver parameters by calling filter parameters on the sender parameters of Bob. So answer.audio.
Yeah, and if your head hurts, well, welcome to the party. Yeah, but the point is it's a quick and easy, dirty way to give you some negotiation stuff without having to worry about all those parameter thingies and capability thingies, which we expect to be rather detailed and rather difficult for the average, joining the RTC club party here. So we don't really necessarily want to expose people to that complexity and be able to quickly get an application running. So that's what they're all about. Somebody reordered my slides here, but that's okay. Can you go to the next slide? Again, continued example. I don't need to talk about it any further. Next slide.
Okay.
Now, Bernard, your
Sure.
game here.
Right. So when you look at examples 7 and 8, they make certain assumptions, which Peter talked about in his overall message, and I think it's important to understand what those assumptions are. We call them invariants. The first assumption was that, and so we have that exchange that we just showed you between Alice and Bob, and the big question is what requirements have to be met for that example to actually work, where that would interoperate, where Alice will send stuff that Bob can receive and vice versa. So the first assumption invariant is that when you filter locally created parameters through remote capabilities, that produces the same result as creating local parameters constrained by remote capabilities. And you can actually see that assumption in the code of examples 7 and 8, because on both sides they're actually asserting that equality, that they're the same, or else they wouldn't get the same thing on both sides. There's also a second, somewhat subtler invariant that's being asserted, and that is one side remotely creates parameters and sends it. For example, Alice creates its parameters, sends it to Bob, and then Bob calls filter parameters. And so there's another equivalence there, which is that filtering remotely created parameters through local capabilities produces the same result as creating remote parameters constrained by local capabilities. And that's basically the assumption that underlines the code examples 7 and 8. I will say there's another potential assumption, which isn't in 7 and 8, but I posted a code example that would make that assumption, which is creating local parameters constrained by remote capabilities is the same as filtering remotely created params through local capabilities. So next slide.
And yeah, we know that is very confusing.
It is confusing, but it's important to understand what the difference between invariant A and B is. Invariant A can be made true by a given browser implementation without looking at what any other browser implementation does. Because invariant A is something that just relates to their local implementation of create parameters and filter parameters. So a browser implementation can make that true. It's within their power to do that. But invariant B relates to the operation of a remote functions with the local functions. So invariant B, either flavor of them, requires compatibility between browser implementations. And so I think you can prove that if invariant B holds either flavor, then the exchange of capabilities or parameters produce equivalent results. So you could write that examples 7 and 8 either in a capability exchange flavor, which would take 2 round trips with invariant B1, or 1 round trip, which is what's actually in the spec. And I think you can also prove that both the capabilities and parameter exchanges will interoperate, but you need both invariant A and invariant B for that to be true. So that's a little bit of a sobering result because it implies that you have to actually standardize in some sense these functions for ORTC to give the interoperability that we're looking for. If you just let browsers go off and do stuff, you might get invariant A but not B.
Well, I think that I never was under the impression that filter parameters could be left unspecified. I think that needs to be, ironed out, in significant detail, the same way that this sort of, the create answer stuff is being written out in a lot of detail for JSEP and WebRTC 1.0.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Sobering, but true.
Well, I mean, yeah, we have two options with that, and I guess it's later in the slide. We can either punt on it completely and say this is a problem for a different layer, or we have to do this documentation work of exactly what filter params does. And basically, what that means is that every single negotiation behavior that might exist, that's defined in like the various specs that touch SDP, probably needs to get looked at in the rules written out here in the actual filter params description.
Over to you, Robin.
Robin, you're muted, actually.
I don't know how that happened. Must be my clicking. Okay, so of course filter params is definable. The question is a little bit rhetoric. The issue is that we have a bunch of the filter parameters as they're defined right now. Well, they're not really defined in how it actually operates. And it turns out that it's really complicated to define beyond the simple use cases. When you talk about simulcast and the SVC, and when you're mixing and matching receiver and sender params and the capabilities. Because you have to go into exacting, precise detail, maybe to the point of even writing out the algorithms themselves. And it is complicated. And that's what I wanted to mention here. Not that it can't be done. And right now, when we discussed on the list, Peter said that, okay, we never expected this to work for complex use cases, so it's only going to work for the simple use cases, and that's enough. And I think probably Justin and I have a different opinion that if we're going to include it, it probably should work for all scenarios, or don't include it at all. Do you want to comment on that at all, Justin? If we can hear your mic, which can't seem to.
He doesn't appear to be muted, so I think he's got a problem again.
Okay. Well, I spoke on his behalf, but I don't know if that assertion is true or not.
Justin, we can't hear you.
Same problem.
If you have comment, can you add it to the IRC or to the Hangout chat, please?
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I just have a general question. Is this an area where prototyping might be helpful?
Yeah, if we're going to define this, I think we do need to prototype this, and we have to go through and really work through the scenarios. I tried to, and I found it extremely difficult to define all of these to actually work, where you take a sender, give it to a receiver, or vice versa, and actually make it be expected to work, especially when you're talking about all the different possible SVC codec combinations that can actually happen when the receiver and the sender don't need the same set of information. So it is a challenge. Okay, so the next slide. Oh, poor Justin. Keeps coming in and out. I really wish he was here. The other thing that I wanted to mention as a whole here is that filter parameters must be definable to the great detail so that someone can take the specification, go ahead. Someone needs to be able to take the specification as is. Did you want anything, Justin? Because you kept popping in and out. I don't know.
Yeah, I had to go find a different room. I heard you saying, is filter params definable? And the only thing I was going to say is that I think we either have to define it fully or we have to yank it. I don't think there's any way we can, with a straight face, say that it only works in some cases.
Okay, so I did speak accurately on your behalf. I don't know if you heard me. Okay, Good. And I agree with you fully on that statement. So for this slide, the important takeaway for this slide is that we have to make sure that every browser can consistently produce the same results for all of these potential combinations. Now, some of these are granted duplicate. Some of these may not necessarily make sense, and we should probably either declare them as illegal or something we don't want to support. But the point is, we have to define every single combination and what is the expected resultant behavior, or just to declare it, you don't do this. Okay? Next slide. The next statement is filtering params helpful. And right now, it can do some simple negotiation scenarios. We would have to greatly expand upon at least the definition of it to make it useful for simulcast SVC, because it can't work as is. I'm not saying it can't be made to work, it just can't work as it's defined right now, which is because it's not defined at all, pretty much. The other takeaway from this is that depending on how you do your signaling, you don't need to use filter params at all, potentially. If you could work with create parameters and capabilities and make your signaling work just fine. Or you could do a negotiation style thing with filter params and work just fine. Or you could use a third-party library to create your own parameters and not use filter params at all. There's no mandate that you must use this thing. It's only to help facilitate, you know, a programmer being able to come in and quickly get their stuff up and running without having to futz around with signaling and negotiation style stuff between capabilities. Next slide. And I'm going to leave filter params alone for a minute and just talk about create parameters for a minute. The purpose of create parameters is it's a helper method. Again, you don't need to use it to quickly get yourself set up with a bunch of parameters that you can shove into the image and go. It's only right now meant to handle simple use cases. You cannot, for example, say I want to have, you know, two different layering schemes that do X and Y. For SVC, it doesn't do that. It's only meant to give you a quick and dirty way to get your parameters set up and ready to go without doing it manually. If we wanted it to handle more complex scenarios, we would need to add some input guidance into create parameters so that it knew what you wanted and intended to do, but that means extending it. But let's leave that for a moment. To the next slide. So again, it works for simple use cases. It does not do anything to do with simulcast, SVC, RTX, and all that. That would require you to go in and muck around with the parameters yourself to get those set up. And it has no additional knobs right now to be able to say define those complex scenarios at all. Okay.
So I agree with the premise that more complicated scenarios need more hints from the application, but I think that many of the things you just mentioned would happen automatically. You know, RTX for certain, and possibly some things like you know, basic SVC. So we should probably be a bit more careful about what things would not, you know, work out of the box.
Yeah, it would be actually useful to try to see if we can at least get the use cases we just described to work. That would be a pretty big win.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. It's not to say that they wouldn't, but they certainly wouldn't give you to exactly what you wanted. They would be, here's a default set, and away you go. It might have SVC, might not. Like, we have to define that.
So, like in discussions with Peter, we've been taking a bunch of stuff out and making it clear. For example, we don't support multi-session transmission, and maybe, you know, as a result of delving into this, we'll come up with a bunch of other things we're not going to try to do. But that's okay as long as we can do the use cases.
Right, and you know, as we've articulated, the goal for this is for people who don't know what buttons to push to not have to work to know what to do. Like you do this automatically through these APIs. If you know what buttons to push, you know, nothing's stopping you. Just go and push them. So I don't think we need to support things like MST, but I do think, just to kind of agree with what everything I was saying, the use cases need to be supported through these filter parameter stuff, or else they're not worth having in there. And so I think we should have an action to basically write examples for each of the use cases and show how create parameters can work.
I think that would be really useful.
I think that's a very good idea. So again, I just want to reiterate some of the take-homes, which Justin already talked about some of this. Right now, as we've defined it, it only works for the very simple use cases. It could be, the point should be that it should handle the rest of the use cases too, at least from a base definition. It is completely optional for an application developer to use. You have to use create parameters or filter parameters. They're merely helper. Filter params, as it's defined right now, is not clear enough for ORTC implementers to go ahead and implement it, so it needs a lot of work. It might be possible to expand the use case coverage for these other use cases beyond what we described, but only at a great additional effort. And getting all browsers to consistently implement create params and filter params is going to be a challenge, because we have to be precise in our definition, otherwise people get it wrong, and even then they might still get it wrong, but at least we have to be accurate in our definition. So the next slide is really what we have to discuss. There are two ways to do this.
1 second though, did we actually have an action item here?
Yes, the action item was that the current create parameters and filter parameters must work for our 3 additional use cases, or at least certainly shouldn't hinder them.
Well, we need to basically, in the use case document we've been talking about, write examples, and there needs to be a way to then make create parameters do the right thing in those use cases.
Right.
Yeah, we should also make sure we cover the basic scenarios, the use cases in the 1.0 version as well.
Right. I mean, I get the sense that we're going to be heading down the realm of, we have these things now in the W3C 1 spec, we call it constraints, but now there's options to create offer answer params or something like that, and basically it's a way of saying, give me something other than the default, and there are hints and that sort of thing. It'll be nice if these things kind of ported over directly from, if it makes sense, from 1.0, so that we have a common sort of verbiage that could be shared between 1.0 and here.
So that would be kind of, I guess, what Robin has called like preferences or something, or?
Yeah, I mean, I understand now the argument for preferences, and preferences are in many ways similar to the constraints or dictionary preferences that 1.0 has. Hints to the application to say, hey, even though I can set the knobs directly myself, I really just want you to give me kind of what the given this mode that I'm asking for, give me all the detailed params that this mode would imply.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was trying to achieve, as well as making sure that the different use cases actually worked. But yes, absolutely true.
Just as one special example, for example, let's say if we have a system supporting more than one audio codec, let's say 711 and then Opus, and what should be the capability when we expose it, and then how we gonna negotiate between 2 systems. We want to make sure when we create parameters, the result should be consistent in a way like that.
It not only should be, must be consistent.
Yeah, the audio cases probably good ones to tackle first, because those hopefully should be a slam dunk, but we'll see.
Right. I mean, I would think that capabilities would say, here are the audio codecs I support, and then the remote side sort of intersects the params that I generated with the capabilities, and any codecs that are not supported by the remote side don't get used in the actual configuration of the RTP center.
Yeah, but if you're supposing both sides are going to support both kind of let's assume the 2 audio codecs, and then we both support 711 and Opus, what should be the output over there? And there must be some kind of definition in the stuff.
Well, that's where the preferences, I guess, would come in, right?
Yeah. before we have that discussion, I think we have to have, like, we're jumping ahead, and but you're absolutely right, and I'm not trying to shut you down, but I think it's really important to have a fundamental decision before we go ahead and decide to talk about, do we want preferences, do we not? What use cases should be supported, which cases should not? And that's the fundamental decision. Do we want to do these pre-made APIs at all? Should they be just, in fact, JavaScript libraries on top? Do we want to have a couple helper routines to facilitate the, the simple usage of the API without having and requiring some kind of JSL layer? So I'm just going to walk through some slides that explain what the implications are, and I'm not sure I got everything, but just the heavy hitters for doing it as a JSL versus baked-in API. So again, create parameters and filter parameters are optional functions to use. An application developer is not required to use them. They are meant to help facilitate the easy usage of our ORTC API for the simple and basic use cases we have defined. But it is should be theoretically possible to implement this entirely as a JavaScript library alternative instead. So next slide. If we did this as a JavaScript library and not include these baked-in APIs at all, it is a lot easier to expand for different use cases because it's a JavaScript library that is completely adaptable and downloadable on demand. So you don't have to worry about your browser vendor covering your use case. You don't like it, you take the JavaScript library, you modify it, you add your favorite feature, and you're done. It also, if we do this as a JavaScript library, it doesn't burden the ORTC implementers to necessarily support these two methods. They can just use this JSL library on top of their implementation, and they're done. Sorry, don't skip ahead, please. Backslide. If we required that it was a JavaScript library, though, that would mean anybody going and programming against ORTC would need to use the JSL or some kind of equivalent functionality to generate those parameters. Otherwise, it would be hell for them to do it by hand. And so the implication here that you could not just, out of the box, take your ORTC implementation and with a few lines of code get a working implementation. You would need a JavaScript library. Can you go back, please? Not next slide.
10 minutes remaining here, just a heads up.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I just need to get through this. And in order for a JavaScript library to work, it requires an expansion of what capabilities defines so that it's possible to write a JSL library in the first place without assuming a whole bunch of stuff in the codex. Next slide. If we do this as a built-in API, that requires a burden on the ORTC implementers. It requires to actually implement these two methods. It's a lot less flexible in terms of backwards and forwards capabilities. It requires a ton of definition from the ORTC spec writers to define what these things do. And we probably are going to have to expand capabilities anyway because we probably would want people to write their own JavaScript libraries or be capable of it. And if we don't do anything, it may not work for a bunch of use cases if, for example, we don't add preferences. So next slide. So these are the three questions. Do we want to do it as a JSL? Do we want to do it as a pre-built library? Should we do a JSL that we ship with the ORTC spec so we have a reference that somebody can take and easily implement our ORTC without baking it into the browser? What do we do? I'm looking for feedback here from you guys.
So we have, there's already an implementation of create params and filter params. It's called SDP. And we don't have to like it, but the work to do all this kind of rule matching and everything like that is going to be fully spec'd and part of the implementation requirements. So what we're basically signing up here, if we decide to take this on, is creating an equivalent thing, and it's only useful for people who need something simple. So one might say, well, why go to all that work if they could just use the 1.0 API in SDP? So my feeling is that we ought to probably remove these and sort of perhaps realize that unless we really think that we're going to charter ourselves to do this work, which is going to be pretty complicated, we should say that folks, perhaps we say that, the 1.0 API, if it's going to shim on top, that's one JSL, and that might be the right way for simple people to do simple things.
I completely agree with your statement 100%. I'd like to hear other people's feedback too.
Yeah, I'm on the same page.
Bernard, what do you think?
I think you're probably right. I have a feeling these things are going to need to be created, but they probably shouldn't be built in.
My only caveat addition is that we need to do the mental exercise of at least going through the capabilities and making sure it's possible to write a JSL layer, period.
Yeah, that will be necessary. Yeah, the other thing is I'm just wondering about the sample code, right? Because a lot of the examples are going to use or need functions like this. So just something to think about.
Right. Well, I think we probably could write a JSL that does the simple stuff pretty easily. If here is, you want to have whatever we want to call it, OSDP or whatever, there's some way of having, a JavaScript description, a JSON description of some of these things, and that you get the params, you get the caps, and it basically does the basic implementation of these things enough to get sample code off the ground. That's probably fine, and then we'll have, I'm sure other things will pop up, for people who have other use cases and stuff like that, and it'll be, there'll be multiple vendors who provide this type of the interoperability layers. This would be a good time to talk about what's the status of the 1.0 shim, because the needs for the capabilities, which I think were very well pointed out by Robin, are also the needs of the 1.0 shim.
Yes.
Very good point. So if we could do the 1.0 shim, it should hopefully cover, someone's alternative. At least that's the principle.
Mm.
Right. So I think what we end up with is we have some example code, and we have the 1.0 shim. And we have example code where we show 1.0 stuff running on top of the shim, on top of ORTC, and then we also have maybe some standalone ORTC code, but then it also has its own mini JSL for doing create params and filter params.
Right.
So it sounds like we've kind of got, unless someone's got an objective, we're kind of in agreement, at least between us, that we should probably do this as a JSL, expand our capabilities according to 1.0 stuff, and to make sure that's possible, and away we go and kind of ship it with for the sake of our samples.
Yeah, I'm gonna get Peter's sort of feedback on this because I didn't have a chance to really talk about it with him. He's out this week. But I suspect he'll probably be in the same camp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Emil, do you have any comment? I'd love to hear your reaction because you usually do have some good comment.
I think that as long as we make sure that JSL is, as long as we generally agree that the JSL is actually buildable, that does sound like the more reasonable approach to take.
Yeah. Yeah, making sure it's buildable is important.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, that. I think that's a reasonable objection.
I think we have an action item here. It sounds like.
Yeah, I think so. To someone to create the beginnings of this JSL, not that it can be used to get our sample code off the ground.
Do you think you can volunteer Peter for that?
Yeah, I think that Peter would be actually a good choice for this.
Especially since he's on vacation in Canada.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. I know that there'll be other vendors like us who are going to obviously need to take a look at that too, so he won't have to work in a vacuum completely. And I'm sure Emil will probably do the same as well for his scenarios.
So it sounds like we're all on the same page there.
Yeah. Okay, so shifting gear, unless someone's got a strong objection, because we got only 7 minutes left. ORTC Endgame. So I'm going to give you what my understanding of how we kind of wrap up this whole community group in the first place, and Michael or whoever else wants to chime in, please do so. I think our goal here is to be able to publish a implementable specification, so that someone who takes this specification and all related stuff and should be able to go ahead and implement ORTC as defined in the API. And once we have this specification, that won't be the final. The final will only come after we get implementer feedback, meaning that in order to truly establish that this can work, we need to have implementations. Once we get implementations, we publish our final report, and then as far as the community group is concerned, we're done. And whether we, there's a possibility of taking this to an existing working group or a new working group or new charter, existing charter, who knows, or potentially even continue and expand upon it in this community group, but that's for a later decision. But that's kind of the overall process. Does anybody have a different understanding or would like to expand upon this?
Well, I think ahead of Justin, I will say that we have to be careful when we say done, right? Final is even a bit strong. I think that the first iteration of a public draft is what we're shooting for here.
Well, I think there are a couple things. I'm not sure what time frame you're thinking of, Robin, when you say like a final report for the CG. But there'd be a public working draft. That's one thing. We think this is actually at the point where we can get implementation. It's not final by any means, but we think that it's pretty well baked. We've got some people, who think this is a pretty good idea, are willing to stand behind it and support it. And we think people should start kicking the tires. And then, the community group still keeps cranking away, but that's kind of like our, hey, check us out party.
It's the hey, this is implementable party.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that should happen rather soon. Yeah.
That needs to happen post haste.
Agree. And then I don't know what your time frame is, but like one possible path is that we kind of keep cranking away and we have implementations emerge, and we get to the point where we say we think we're pretty happy with where this is. We have a last call, and we kind of say, we've completed our mission as a community group, and here's our final work product of our specification, and we pat ourselves on the back and shut down. And that to me sort of feels like, just based on how long these implementations tend to take, probably a year or so away from now, best case. So what does that match your expectation, Robin, or?
Completely. And I just want to add further comment that some of the stuff, like the stats and the IDP, or well, maybe not IBDP anymore, was in flux. And we've hesitated defining some of those points, and I would like to have an implementable spec, even if they don't contain every single aspect, like the stats or IDP, at least to get implementers on board and starting this process, even before we have that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of things like that in DTMF, right? The goal is, ORTC is not intending to differ from 1.0, right? It's just intending to basically be compatible, so.
Yeah.
Right. So that gets into an interesting question of like, well, in between these two things of, hey, we're ready for implementations, and hey, we're done, it's very likely that this will actually graduate perhaps ahead of schedule into the WebRTC 1.0 working group, where I imagine what we would probably want to see happen is that the WebRTC 1.0 docs go to working group last call, and then this becomes accepted as we do a call for consensus to see if the 1.0 working group wants to proceed with the output of this community group as a future direction? And if so, then this becomes an extension document, in the 1.0 working group. And so I think that would be a good outcome for us of this thing graduating from its community group into something that really is on the critical path for the overall WebRTC effort. But that would be a bit of a shift in our deliverables, because at that point in time we would sort of hand off control of the actual documents. Of it. Like, we got to a point where we were very happy with it, but it will continue. It will proceed and graduate to a full specification over in the WG as opposed to here.
Yeah, my only caveat to that is that I would like to definitely have something that is implementable before we shove it over, just because otherwise, if we have holes, I think we're going to get laughed out, first of all. And so we can't have holes. And then the second thing is that I just want to make sure that their goals and alignment align with what our goals are, because once we hand it over, we have effectively zero control anymore. And this community group came to exist for a reason. I would hate to see that ruined, so to speak, with other strong alternative objectives that don't match our own.
Which is a very fair concern, and I totally agree. I think the first part of the timing is not going to be an issue. As I mentioned, this would happen post this is ready for implementation, and this is going to graduate. But on the 1.0 time frame, that they need to get to WGLC anyway, and that's not going to happen immediately. So I agree that we need to make sure we don't have any holes, but I think that our calendar actually looks better than theirs.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
The other thing, just on your second point, as part of this moving over, there would be a consensus call, within the WG to say that we're actually going to go and pursue this, and it probably requires a charter update to at least incorporate, the milestones that will be necessary here. So I think that any of the debate that needs to happen around are people really on board from the WG on this would happen at that time, and if there were objections, then we would just continue ahead here in the CG.
I think
that's all fair.
Yeah, I think that all makes perfect sense, Justin, and I think that we should be shooting for a public draft, before the end of June, let's say, just to put some timing around it.
Yeah, I think, and we don't have to do it right now, but it would be good to understand what bugs we still need to fix to get to that point, and we can hash that out on the list.
Yeah.
So the end of June draft would be what we've been calling 1.1, sort of a...
Would be the public draft, yeah.
That's what I'm proposing, yeah.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there is no 1.0, because 1.0 is to not be confused with WebRTC. We don't call it 1.0, but there is only a 1.1.
Yeah.
I would call the current editor's draft 1.0.
Yeah. Just for the record, the charter of the 1.0 working group runs out in February, I believe. So presumably late this year at the latest, the W3C staff will be taking a close look at WebRTC 1.0, ORTC, just trying to figure out how to move forward. So, I mean, obviously, I think we're all part of both sides of that conversation. So.
They can also get an extension, though, I think is.
Yeah, they can, but they would really have to say we are seriously almost done. They would. I think they would have to. There's. I'm not sure. That's a good point, but I think that would be a good opportunity for us to say, hey, let's take this opportunity to figure out a longer-term roadmap other than just extending WebRTC 1.0 for another 6 months to try to get however far they think they can get.
Yeah, good point. So is everybody kind of on that same page that we should be shooting for an end of June public draft, barring any unforeseen events?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm all in favor for that. And I think that giving filter params and as a JSL and as well as crate params might actually make that more achievable as a result. So.
Excellent.
One interesting question is what will be runnable when we do our first that draft? Because I think that will be one of the first questions.
Yep, agreed.
Is this just a document or are there actual implementations? And I know that there's some Microsoft preview that was announced recently. Bernard, can you speak to the state of that?
That wouldn't certainly implement all of the capabilities that are here. I mean, it could be a further evolve to help understand things, but it's still a couple of revisions back.
I think that the hook flash contributions to the ORTC mobile libraries should come together relatively quickly after we've seen the API ratified. Yeah,
the only issue is that we're not a browser, so it doesn't define the JavaScript part. We can say that, yeah, we've got a compatible C++ version, but not an actual thing that does JavaScript. So,
it'd be handy for testing, though, I think is my point.
Yeah.
I mean, even if we had the reverse shim or whatever, it would really be good to have something where we could say, hey, look at this basic AppRTC like thing running on top of the 2.0 API. This is not just smoke and mirrors. We actually have spent a bunch of time thinking about this. And
Yep, I like it.
Not everything works, but something works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be a good goal to try and do. I don't know who'd be tasked with it, but someone to actually take the effort of writing over the WebRTC 1.0 shim so that we could have an API like this to play with.
I thought we already decided that. I thought Peter was doing that work.
Come on, the guy's on vacation. Don't kill him. He comes back.
Okay, I redact that last comment.
So, has there been any work on dinking around with this? What do we call that thing? The up shim or down? Where be?
I don't know. I don't remember the name.
The 2.0 to 1.01, where a 2.0 API thunks down to an existing 1.0 implementation.
That's the down shim.
Yeah.
That was put on hold a long time ago because of the flux of the specification. It might be possible to revise that effort, but I think we would need a little extra helpers to do that.
Yeah, I think we really need to get to this public draft, and then we can restart all that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Okay, is there another slide that we have to look at here, Robin?
No, that's it.
That's it.
Just the thank yous. Unless there's any further comment. Is there an action item we need to take out of that before we say thank you?
Well, I think we need to be clear on when do we think we'll have runnable code, for press or anybody else who want to kick some tires here and see, is this thing really well thought out? I know there's been that. There's that one blogger who kind of went off and said, well, the stuff is just a bunch of pie in the sky stuff. I'm sure there will be more of that, and so it would be nice to have something that demonstrates this is ready for at least basic use.
Wholeheartedly agree. I think we need not just a public specification, public draft. We also need example code that people can implement to go along with it.
Yeah. To get their head around it, a lot of times you just want to see the whole application and say, what lines of code is it to get this thing working?
Yeah, a running application somewhere would be nice.
Yeah. Well, our objective is to do the C++ side of it, but I cannot promise that we're going to achieve the other because we don't have the manpower, I think, to do it at this moment.
Yeah, we're going to need some additional bodies kicking in some help on that one.
We could kick in some help on doing the app, but it sounds like the actual runtime. The thing that would be either closest is the coming up with a shim, or taking the stuff that Microsoft has released as the plugin, and at least getting that to the point where it can do the basic stuff.
You realize that's only audio, right?
It's got video now.
Oh, it does?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
It actually supported SVC, but
Is that something your group can do, Michael?
Yeah, I know we're sort of in our, planning for our next fiscal year. I can't commit to it, but it's something. we've gotten a lot of interest both within the company and outside the company for keeping this going.
Yeah, I mean, getting these list of tasks is pretty important because once we have those list of things that need to get done, Michael and I can work on getting them funded.
Right. How about this whole effort started in a GitHub project. Is there, can we kind of recruit people to actually commit some code for the shim
we should actually continue the GitHub project, but to make that effort work, we're going to need to at least one body to put some time into it. Because if we got nobody, it'll advance pretty slowly. So that's all.
But
someone to spearhead it. Anyway, maybe nobody can commit today, but let's at least agree that
I'll talk about that in our planning.
Yeah, I think the process is you get to a public spec, you then have a call for implementations and also for work on all these different projects that relate to it, and that's when that stuff kicks off.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, we're over time by 9 minutes, so we really need to wrap up.
I just had one quick question about this thing. Does it really have to be the shim that we start with? Because, for example, Philip Hankage started trying to port Jitsi Meet over Microsoft's ORTC. We hit some ICE bugs. We sent those back. But we'd be much more interested in making that work over ORTC rather than fighting with the shim and all that.
I full-heartedly agree, but I think unfortunately we have to get Microsoft's commitment to be able to do that because it's their code, right? And until they can, it's kind of hard to say yes, we can commit to that.
But isn't that the same commitment as committing to the shim?
No, because anybody could contribute to the shim, but only Microsoft can contribute to that plugin, as I understand it right now. That's the issue.
Yeah, the plugin's closed code.
No, but what I meant was that in both cases the implementation needs to be working.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was
unfortunately, that plugin depends on a lot of proprietary code. There's a JavaScript and Node sort of surface to it, but a lot of the guts are proprietary. Just to bootstrap the whole thing. It'd be great to get this moved. To better implementation. But it's work and it's got to be funded somehow.
Yeah, the JavaScript examples have to be written. There has to be some form of application running somewhere that demonstrates the capabilities. So let's try and figure it out.
Okay, well, let's continue trying to work on the spec, and let's try and have everybody try and get some funding or resources or whatever they can commit together to try and help this process, either through shim, through the plugin, or if someone wants to actually implement it in their browser, even better. So.
Yeah, I suspect that what we'll have you better do in the short term is some sample apps, hopefully like this plugin implementation, and maybe if we can find some volunteers like this downshim. I didn't hear anyone speaking up saying that they could specifically work on the downshim.
Let me take that offline with Robin, Justin, and we'll have a discussion around that and get back to you on the list.
Okay. If you think that thing can actually move forward, we might be able to help out with that.
Okay. Well, I can say that if you're willing to work with us on that, then we might have an opportunity to do something with that with you.
Okay. I mean, does any sort of even like rough version of the downshim already exist?
Yeah, the Christoph originally, who's on this call, actually wrote that original shimming stuff, and so there is a very roughed up version, but it is ancient at this point, and so far
I think
off
it's deprecated.
Probably need to start from scratch at this point.
I think it's pretty well deprecated, and we'd have to do a restart. But I think we would be motivated to work with you on that, Justin, if you're interested.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to oversubscribe here, but if we didn't have to get the thing off the ground and we just had to do like flush out some parts, Peter might be able to spend some time there. So we'll see.
It has to get done, right? Like, in order for this draft to be taken seriously when the spec is published, there has to be an implementable solution somewhere.
Well, that wasn't what I just heard a second ago. That what I heard was that let's get the spec stuff done, and then we'll spend time on implementation. So I don't know if that doesn't match what you just said.
No. My point is that having example code is great when we publish the spec, but soon thereafter, people are going to want to see it running.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah, they don't have to be exactly the same time, but we do, to be taken seriously, we need it, obviously.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, horse has been thoroughly beaten.
Okay, next slide, which is the wrap-up. Just thanks to everybody here, basically, Microsoft and Google, and everybody's individual names there. Don't need to repeat it because we're so over time. But thanks again for everybody's help. And for more information, there's your 2 links. That's it. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thanks for hopping on, everybody, and we'll see you on the list. And I'm going to stop the broadcast.